Hello everyone and welcome to the fourth edcom webinar. It is a pleasure to invite every month a leading professional to talk to you about the newest topics in advertising. This month we invited Arnold, who is going to talk about the magic and power of storytelling in business. Paul, thank you for joining us and you have the word.
Thank you very much. So yes, as I just said, today I want to talk to you about the magic and power of storytelling. And I want to do this in three chunks. The first is to set the backdrop. So I will talk to you about stories in a very general way. Second, I will talk about the role of stories within brands. And thirdly, I will touch upon the role of stories in organizations. So first, the backstory about stories. When we look at this and we go back to the beginnings of time, story is actually innate. It was one of the first ways that we spread information around about how we may have found food or to avoid danger. And certainly we know that, from all the sort of neurology work, that people store memory in stories. And 70% of what we learn comes through stories. And a psychologist, Jerome Bruner, found that infants as young as 2 could decipher and tell stories. But critically, stories help us make sense of the world and our lives. And all the great religions have relied on the power of story to help shape their societies, because they knew the power of stories to connect with people and the way they rapidly get passed on through society as easily transported to nuggets of information. That's what makes stories so powerful. And that's because stories connect at a very deep spiritual level. We talk a lot in advertising and in other forms about, and particularly in business, about rational communication, and that goes so far. And when you look at advertising really goes the next level down. It really uses a lot of emotion to drive connection. And while story also works there, I actually believe story works at a much deeper level. It works at a place of actually the spiritual, the soul, because it connects with our very identity and our purpose. Because we're all trying to make sense of the world we live in, and actually we are meaning-making machines. That's why stories are so important. Because fundamentally, stories are carriers of meaning. That's what they are. They're little pockets to help make sense of the world and the lives we're living in. And you think about it within your own place. It's not the event that actually sparks you to act in a certain way. It's actually the meaning you put on an event. So someone says something to you, and you then interpret and you add meaning to it. And that meaning has been informed by all the past stories you have created. That person doesn't like me, that person does like me. And through the meaning, it creates the emotional state, which therefore drives your behavior, which therefore affects your performance. So actually, meaning is the critical part of what a story carries. And that's why embodied in all the children's stories, there is a meaning, there's a moral. And this is a great book, by Robert McKee. And actually, in it, he says that we get hooked by stories. And it's because actually we're trying to find our story in their story. In the book, he makes a great phrase about how we don't go to the cinema to escape reality. We go to the cinema to find reality. We want to discover how to make sense of our world, how to work it. And that therefore means that stories do connect to us, into our own deeper archetypal stories we're all trying to work through. And Christopher Booker talked about the 7 basic plots, which I'll sort of take you through now. And these are like, helping us to make sense of the world. And so you've got overcoming the monster, and the basic moral of that, and the strategy for success in life is that good defeats evil. And these stories can be told time and time and time and time again. We never tire of these stories. So we have the James Bond, we have Terminator, we have King Kong, we have Jaws, all about overcoming the monster. We have Rags to Riches, which the embodied moral of that is you can improve your life. So we have, Pretty Woman here, but you have Cinderella, Blindside, My Fair Lady, are all telling you that actually, if you stay true to who you are, actually you can get a better life. But then we have the quest, so beautifully typified in Lord of the Rings, this idea of, if you explore, you grow, and the idea that actually, great things come from when we're prepared to actually move out of our comfort zone and go out, and we then find things that are really important for us. So Indiana Jones, Watership Down, 10,000 BC are all stories in that line. Voyage and Return, this whole idea about actually sometimes, what we have at home is actually just as important to us. And so consequently, Alice in Wonderland, Wizard of Oz, Dr. Zhivago, even The Devil's Wear Prada are all basic stories about, yes, go out there, but sometimes we ignore what's so good about what we currently have. And then we have the idea about comedy, about, in the unfairness and the tragedy of life, actually a way of helping to deal with that is to see the funny side of things. So, Some Like It Hot, Mamma Mia, 40 Towers, all these fantastic comedy. And tragedy is as simple as you think it is. All the warning bells of Pride Before the Fall, and so we have Portrait of Dorian Gray, Blood Diamond, all things about, say, watch out, retribution will come if you try to break the cardinal rules of the way we live as a society. And rebirth is again a one you can change. So, this whole idea that, the Christmas Carol thing from Dickens, the pursuit of happiness are all about how we can grow and change. Now, when you look at the architecture of a good story, you tend to find we first of all have to have an outline thing. We need to engage with a character, someone who we are interested in, someone we identify with. But critically in the middle is what we call the arc of the story. It's where there's some conflict, some issue, some dilemma. And what happens is we then follow the action, we follow the plot to then get to a resolution, the happy ever after. Because we're trying to understand what is the way they did it to help deal with their problems in life. And brands do this as well. They set up the conflict. How can I have the life I lead but still have to clean the floor? And so we have embedded into that is the moral of the story, which is often not said, but it shouts out very loudly because our unconscious finds it and makes sense of it. So that's a bit about stories. I now want to go and talk about brands, and the role of how stories can help with brands. So, basically engagement is the key issue we struggle with when we're looking at brands is oversaturated communications market. And stories have a unique power of cutting through and creating long-lasting engagement because a story changes the way we feel about something, changes the way we feel about ourselves. And stories we know operate at an unconscious emotional level, often bypassing the head. And often if I say to you, I want to tell you a story, you're sitting comfortably, a long, long time ago in a land far, far away, there lived a king. And when you say that, you find your body just drops a bit. It goes into a very slight trance state and allows communication to operate at a subconscious level. And, we know that expectations are the engine of our perception, and a story really helps to influence how a person perceives an event or an experience. And actually, the story about the Riedel wine glasses, the beautifully crafted, made of the finest glass, all that stuff helps to make you feel that when you drink the wine is pure, is better, is clearer. So we buy and we drink the story. I did a lot of work with Echo Shoes, and we talked about giving to the shop staff when they're fitting the shoes at that point of truth stories. Stories about how, Echo Shoes are the only people who still make all their own shoes, about how they were so passionate about having really great quality leather that as such they actually developed their own lemons, to the point that actually Prada recognizes that they make the best leather and they use their leather. So those stories, when you tell them to people they put on the shoe, they don't just put on the shoe, they wear the story. And that becomes an important thing for brands. And actually stories can fundamentally shift behavior. The whole Obama thing, I know that in about 4 or 5 weeks' time we're coming up to again. But a barn was so successful because he told a fundamental, story of hope, of belief, of change. And we bought into that, Americans bought into that, because they wanted to have that story. Because we will follow a leader whose story we believe in. And actually that's the critical thing. And, the truth is, the things we buy, the clothes we wear, are all vital components of the story we're trying to tell ourselves and the story we're trying to find. So that's why there is this move towards more value-based brands. Well, when Nike talks about their values, it's because we engage with their values and we see those values to be our own. So we buy into their story because their story is our story, and that's what we try and do. So the driver of an SUV is telling a very different story about who he is from a driver of, say, a sort of Prius. And there's this, Scott Bedbury, who used to be the marketing director at Nike and is now over at Starbucks, has written very eloquently about this. And I just thought it was important to really capture this. A great brand is a story that's never completely told. We'll come back to that later on. A brand is a metaphorical story that connects with something very deep, a fundamental human appreciation of mythology. Companies that manifest this invoke something powerful. Stories create the emotional context people need to locate themselves in a larger experience. That's all the stuff I said about it helps to make sense of the world in which we live in. And brands can often play out archetypal roles. So this is one example which we talk about brand archetypes, where we think about a brand telling a story, a story of creator that Apple does, the story of caregiver that Fairy does, the story of regular guy that Gap does, the story of lover that Haagen-Dazs does. And so that manifests itself in the stories they tell. So to take two classic brands, whether these brands are actually operating in your market, you may recognize them still, is you've got the sort of the Procter & Gamble Ariel brand, which tells the hero story, their battle against the fight against dirt and grime. And note the Greek mythological links into that, and the links into the sea and things like that. So very clever sort of semiotics going on there. And Persil, or the Omo brand, with their dirty is good, is really trying to position itself about explorer. This idea about, actually it's about true dirty play that we discover and we grow. So picking up some fundamental archetypal things. And the internet is helping us to tell more stories and tell more of the story about the brand. So, the Starbucks Facebook site, for example, invites people to tell their story, and they can tell you more about their sort of work they're doing in terms of sort of CSR. And they invite people to make suggestions about how can you make a better coffee. Maybe I can keep my sleeve and we don't need to waste as much money on new carpets. So therefore it's creating a more engaging story that's going on. And the reality is that the story is absolutely the part that helps to turn something from being purely functional to being much more emotional. Because we don't buy the functionality, we buy the story attached to it. And increasingly these days, we are finding that actually, it's no longer the brand just speaking out and saying the brand is like this. It's been co-created, and the consumer is having an increasing role in helping to co-create that space of what the brand story is. And so some lovely examples of that. There was this great thing about a $5 walking stick was sold on eBay for $65,000. $65,000, because the mother told a story about how it held the ghost of her deceased father. And it got 132 bids on eBay, and it appeared on NBC TV. So the power of the story was what made that be a different cane. And increasingly, if we're trying to find points of distinction, it's within the authentic story we find that. So why are we prepared to pay €2 for a bottle of water versus 50 cents? It's because we buy into their story, because their story validates our story. And we've got to be careful that, about the bad stories. All this stuff about, all the background stories that we hear out, and the internet is just a thriving place for that. And we know that bad stories travel faster and further than good stories. So it's about finding your brand story. Where do you look for it? And we look at it in the histories and how the product is made, how the product is used, culture, and I'll quickly nip through a couple of these. A critical thing is authenticity is key. You need to find your truth. I don't want a made-up story because the truth will out. And we must find authenticity. And when we radiate out that authenticity, like a beacon, then that will attract people who share that. That's why we talk about value brands. So we don't want to chase the competitor's story. We want to find our own story because that's our own place of authenticity. So history, the classic one, so the General's brand, tells a lot about, about the archaeology of this brand. It's a very strong place. Chrysler talks a lot about its values, and this great ad it did on Super Bowl about its halftime America was really about its values of perseverance, about pulling together, which really therefore was, it's their story, but it's our story. And because it's halftime America, we're all struggling in the same place, really deeply connected through a great story, told by a great storyteller. The product story, Bird's Eye, a company who makes sort of frozen fish in the UK, tell a wonderful story about the provenance of where their fish comes from and how they don't put dyes into it. So they don't do anything else, but they just tell that story, and it's a very important story to be told. And that story can be told in many different places. So Pret, a chain of high quality sandwiches, print their story on their napkins, and that is therefore as powerful a place because the story demands to be told in many different places, in many different shapes and forms. And the product and use, this is a fantastic old ad done by Mercedes, was taking a real family, the Nice family in South Africa, and how they survived a head-on crash. So that therefore really amplified and gave real authenticity and real credibility to the fact we believe that Mercedes are very safe cars. And consumer stories. So Sensodyne have always talked about the consumer story, about what it's like for me to suffer sensitivity and the problems which I've had. And they're very real people talking about, their little things that goes on in their life. And Johnny Walker has done some fabulous work about this whole idea about keep walking, about the spirit of progress. But they do it particularly on their website through taking individual people's stories. Walk with the architect who reshaped Beirut, walk with the Russian's most successful restaurateur, walk with the most awe-inspiring iron, because we are drawn by their stories because we try to make sense and find our own stories. And remember, this idea about we're always in beta, the story is constantly evolving, it's not to be carved in stone. There's not one way of telling it, it constantly keeps being told. And sure, there are some great stories in ads, and I want to make a very clear distinction. And we engage with those stories like, the Stella Artois, which is linked very much into some of the famous, films like Jean de Florette and Manon de Sauce. But we engage with them purely at a surface level because we love their stories. But fundamentally, they don't connect to the deeper level of the brand. So we connect with the story, but we don't connect through to the brand. And that's where we've got to make sure we tell the right stories, because these are not authentic stories. A brand story only really creates a deeper meaning when it comes from the truth in the brand. So the very last thing, the organizations, using stories in organizations. And, we've just had the most fabulous sort of Olympics. And, Seb Coe, who was a past sort of gold award winner himself, led that. And basically, he told a story, a very personal story, to the IOC, and this is what he said. When I was 12 years old, I was marched into a large school hall with my classmates, and we watched grainy pictures from the 1968 Mexico Olympic Games. 2 athletes from our hometown were competing. John Sherwood won a bronze medal in the 400 meters. His wife Sheila just narrowly missed gold in the long jump. By the time I was back in my classroom, I knew what I wanted to do and what I wanted to be. 35 years on, I stand before you with those memories still fresh, still inspired by this great movement. So the power of story absolutely won by a fingernail's breadth against the French in giving us the Olympic Games. You know, and stories actually basically avoid critical analysis. They operate at an unconscious level, triggering emotions that help overcome resistance. Therefore, they're less scrutinized by the rational brain, so you can actually allow things to be said that could not otherwise be said. You know, and that's the power of them, because they're almost non-directed, they're non-combative, so they avoid the ego and they diffuse conflict. And they're communicating in a very subtle and a very respectful way, because I can tell a story about me, which you identify with, but I'm not saying you, I'm saying me. And you can say, I get it. And you get the morality, so you get the moral of what that story is actually about. You know, we talk about the CEO is the chief storyteller of the organization. And obviously, Steve Jobs did the most fabulous job about what he did for that brand. You know, because in truth, in business, people don't buy you, they buy your story. And, you know, Howard Gardner talks about how, you know, the storytelling is the key skill of leadership. And we follow the person with a big story because we want to be part of that big story. That's what leaders do. So the last chart is really saying, you know, the different ways storytelling is used in organizations is to help inspire the vision, to help communicate their values, to help build a culture, to gain commitment, to provide focus and direction, to spark action and change, to actually share knowledge and make sense of it, to develop credibility and reconcile differences. So a quick run through, but in summary, it's important whether it's for you or your brand, you need to find the authentic story. That's the most important. And don't just tell stories, you must live them, you must develop them, you must grow them. And the final thing is to remember, what is your own story you want the world to hear? And if you can develop that story, then people will want to listen to you and follow you. So really, that's all, folks. You know, there's going to be, this will be posted up onto the edcom website, but it's really a case of sort of getting any questions that you may have for me, which I'll try and answer. So, I will read them out as I've got them. Hey Paul, great presence so far. I was wondering if you will share your presentation. Can we download from somewhere? Yes, as I said, that will be on the edcom website. Nissa, would you be right to say that the only right way to tell a story is to tell it in a way as if the audience was part of it? I don't know if I'll be as prescriptive as that. I think, part of, certainly what we know is that when you tell a story, one of the things is the story is sort of co-created with the people you tell it to, because how they react, the bits that they respond to, actually makes you want to sort of pick up that bit and follow that train. But I think that actually they will find your story through your own story. Those are the two questions I have so far. I'll wait a couple of minutes in case anyone's got another question to ask me. Right. Heritage is a powerful tool for brands, but what about the future? Well, I think you can tell a story of your future. And one of the interesting exercises I do is I get people to write back from the future. And what that is about is this idea about where do you want to be in 10 years' time? Now tell me back the story about how you got there. And actually you think about what Obama was doing. He was telling a story about the future rather than a story of the past. It's very interesting. We just had Ed Miliband, who is the sort of leader of the opposition, who did a very big story about his own personal past. So we can tell different stories. Okay, our story is truly important for a bottle of water. Don't they only apply to high involvement consumer goods? No, I don't agree. I think what I'd say is, if there is an authentic story, if you can tell the story about water, which is about how it's been specially, caught over the bubbling brooks of the Icelandic, waters, and it's being purified. That's a powerful story we get into because we love the idea of purification. I think I just saw a question from Mickey Dennehy, who asked something about Seth Cohen and his story. I think actually his story was a profoundly important story in the Olympics, and it helped to really demonstrate that even at the very highest, very rationally driven place, stories play a fundamental role, and so it made a very important thing. That's it.
All right, thank you very much, Paul. It was a pleasure to have you, and I can already say we already have very good feedback from your presentation. Thank you everyone for taking part in today's webinar, and don't forget to check the eacaeducation.eu website for upcoming webinars. Have a good day and see you at the next webinar.
Thank you very much, everyone.